I'm a member of the Historical Commission for the cause of beatification and canonization of Father Theodore, the servant of God. And we were appointed in April the 28th, 2008 by the Cardinal Vicar of Rome. I also wrote a short biography of Father Theodore in 1989. And as a member of that committee, we're supposed to gather his writings and other documents to present them to the diocesan tribunal to promote his cause. And the other members of this committee, the historical committee, are Father Cassian Uhas and Father Lawrence Rywald. But today, I would like to present Father Theodore's life, and first of all to present it in a short video form, which I hope we will be able to see as I pluck it out from my computer there. And then I would like to make some reflections on his life as a possible saint in our church. So if you don't mind, first of all, let's take a look at this video. The cause for beatification and canonization of Father Theodore Foley was introduced in Rome at the Lateran Palace, May 9th, 2008. Father Foley was Superior General of the Passionists when he died in 1974. He's honored by the Passionists as a holy priest, a quiet, strong leader who sustained his community and others in the Church in the last half of the 20th century. He brought heroic hope to troubled times. Theodore Foley was born and raised in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a devout Irish Catholic family, the first child of Michael and Ellen Bible Foley. His sister Marie was born 3 years after him. Daniel Foley, as he was called then, was a likable and popular boy. He grew up in the north end of Springfield, then a thriving industrial city in America's Northeast. He went to Sacred Heart Parochial School and was nourished by the rich religious life in his home and in Sacred Heart Church, one of the city's most beautiful religious buildings. Passionist priests sometimes preached at Sacred Heart. Weekend retreats at the Passionist Retreat House in West Springfield fostered a desire in young Daniel to enter the Passionists when he was just 14. The Passionists were then a growing Catholic religious community in the American Church, drawing members from the Irish, German, Polish, Slovak, and Italian immigrants who'd come to the country. The Passionists were known for their saints: St. Paul of the Cross, their founder; St. Gabriel, the young Passionist student canonized in 1920. In 1921, American Passionists went as missionaries into Hunan in China. It was a community reaching out to the world. Daniel Foley took the religious name Theodore. He seemed made for the Passionist life.
He was always in good disposition. He was not a moody person at all. And he wasn't one of these people that would, tell you about his great exploits. He's very modest. He never got anything of what Theodore accomplished. He was very quiet in class, very quiet in recreation. And yet he was always there with the smile in the background, would break out from time to time. So he was always a delight, but he was, to me, always kind of a mystery. What was going on in the back of that mind that just so quiet, and the face that didn't show much more than smiling? Didn't he ever really get sad or down in spirit? I never caught him in any bad mood. He was always at his best. And I remember one time I was sacristan, and Saturday afternoon was a day of work for us in the sacristy. or whichever your office was. And I had visitors. I had visitors from home, my own family. So when they left, maybe 4:30 in the afternoon, I came into the sacristy with the idea, I have to finish up here and show that I did some work, at least on the weekend. Well, it was all finished. And a little while later, Theodore said to me, I knew you were busy, so I wasn't too busy myself. So I came and I just took care of your office and brought it up to date. Of course, he did it better than I would have done it, too. About his holiness, what virtues stood out? Well, I guess you'd say he was a very humble guy because, he had all this talent and he was very good in his studies, but you never would gather that from ordinary conversation with him. And he certainly was charitable. He was one that was always doing little things for other people. And he had a prayer life that was very, very steady. I was across the choir from him, I think, for almost 8 years. He was on one side, I was on the other. And you'd see him there in that same position, that same expression as you saw him other places. But every once in a while, he'd go into a smile. And maybe at Mass, you'd see a smile on his face. So, that indicated a happy interior. So I hope that what I give today can help his whole cause to move forward, to show that he was really a regular person and yet an extraordinary person. He was different than any of the rest of us, and yet he wasn't as outspoken or as one that would be as evident or, to make himself known, but yet he was so consistent, so solid, so ready to do what the Lord wanted him to do that I'd have to say he was one of the best.
Ordained as a priest in 1940, Father Theodore was sent to Catholic University of America, where he earned a degree in theology, and afterwards he spent 8 years teaching Passionist seminarians.
Personality-wise, he was just so kind, so gracious, so interested in everyone. Anyone that had contact with him came to talk to him about something. And then as a professor, he was just superb. He would come into class and begin with a little reminder on the board of what we covered yesterday. Then he'd go into the lesson of the day. And then the next day the same. A bit of a review of the past. He made it easy to learn. Easy to learn. And I didn't find out till much later, that he actually tore up his own notes at the end of every school year so that he would be forced to start again and integrate the new things he had read and studied in his own personal study. So he was a marvelous teacher, but also he came across as a friend. Years later, when he was transferred to Rome and elected assistant general over there, he just loved people. So although his Italian was poor and he was just starting, he didn't have Spanish and so on, he'd be around talking to them all with that smile of his, enjoying their company, encouraging them in his own way, both the priests, the brothers, and the sisters who helped in our community. He was a great man, marvelous teacher, but above all was his example. He was just a totally devoted Passionist. Whether it was on the solitary walk, the gardens, and so on. Man of prayer, constant prayer, you could tell that. And that spirit of his just came from his heart, and a sincere interest as the Lord taught us in one another.
Universally admired by members of his province, as a teacher and spiritual director, Father Theodore was made superior of St. Paul's Monastery, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1956. In 1958, Theodore was elected General Consultor of the worldwide Passionist community headquartered in Rome. In 1964, he was elected their Superior General. The last period of Theodore's life was the most demanding of all for him. The Passionists were growing as a worldwide community. During Theodore's term as consultor, the congregation grew rapidly in Asia, Africa, and South America. In 1968, as Superior General, he saw the community reach its peak membership of 4,152 religious. Much of his time was spent visiting faraway houses and members, presiding at provincial chapters, settling questions and difficulties that arose among the religious, and representing the interests of the congregation in Rome. It took long hours of travel, correspondence, and patient listening, which engaged him for 16 years. These years were not ordinary years. He arrived in Rome while the community was still dealing with the aftermath of World War II. And then, in the 1960s and 70s, the Western world entered a period of turbulent social unrest. Youth protests, political confrontations, assassinations, anti-establishment, and anti-war demonstrations shook Western society. Violence erupted in the large cities of America and elsewhere. Traditional values were called into question. Church membership declined. Uncertainty increased. The Second Vatican Council, called by Pope John XXIII, raised the promise of new energy and hope, but the times were marked by great confusion and division. Theodore Foley brought to these times a holiness that's needed when everything is falling apart.
Our Theodore, man of the people, man who loved people, very bright man, but always humble. We are just so proud of him, and we look at him and say he was a holy man. That's the big thing. That's how he could put all of this together. People came to the door, people in need, people hungry, people asking for money, whatever it was, people asking to be blessed, the sick and the hurting. He was there to help them. You've heard that at the end of his life he came down with an illness. He had been traveling through the world on visitations, stopped in Springfield. That was his last visit. He visited his sister and his Aunt Caroline. And then he made his way back to Rome, but went right into the hospital. It turned out he had acquired some disease of the lungs principally, in the heart and so on, that weakened the heart. The pressure was sort of a virus or something that he had picked up and been carrying. He knew he wasn't feeling well. So he was in the hospital, and just at that time our order had what we call a synod, an assembly. And so our provincial father, Flavian Doherty at the time, and I were called to that synod. So when we got to Rome, Theodore was in the hospital, had been there about a month by that time, but he wasn't allowed to have any visitors except the assistant general. And every night about 9 o'clock, of course some had snuck over in between, but every night about 9 o'clock the vicar general would come back from the evening visit to Father Theodore in the hospital and give us a little report. And on this particular night, he said to, Vicar General said that Father Theodore is still very, very weak, but the doctors are doing the best they can, and that he sends his love to all of us. He was more interested in us and telling us not to be worried about him. He was doing as well as he could do. And then that Vicar General called me aside that evening and said, Father Norbert, Father Theodore would like to see you tomorrow morning. And he told me to tell you that even if they tell you he's not to have visitors, he wants to see you tomorrow morning. So I was looking forward to that, and we dispersed. And not 15 minutes later, the news came that Theodore had died. Well, it was an enormous shock. We knew he was ill. We knew he was in poor health. We knew he was suffering. They told us his last words were, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I give you my heart and my soul. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Then he passed to the Lord. I was able, because they hadn't considered it, Father Theodore was only the second person to die in office as our Superior General. And so they presumed he was going to be buried in Rome. But I pleaded with our authorities to please let us have our Mass there for him. And which we did, and generals of all the other orders. Father Rupe, the Jesuit general at the time, I remember, was the first in the hospital to visit Theodore before we brought the body into our Basilica of Saints John and Paul. So we had the funeral mass there, and then we brought him home to his beloved sister Marie and to his Aunt Caroline. Those were precious days. But the memory of Theodore, the man of prayer, the man who loved the Lord with his whole heart, loved people, loved to serve people, whatever the class, whatever the condition, he was there for them because he was a priest, because he was a passionist. May the passion of Jesus Christ be always in our hearts. Thank you.
The life of Theodore Foley really raises some questions for us. First of all, is he a saint? And then secondly, what kind of saint is he? Of course, we know there are different kinds of saints, aren't there? There's the saints that we celebrate on November the 1st, on the Feast of All Saints, that great multitude that no one can count from every race and nation and people and tongue that stand before the throne of God and praise him. Some of those we could call household saints. They're the people whom their families and their parishes or their communities recognize as good and holy people. And of course, as time goes by, they're largely forgotten. And then also in that great multitude, of course, there are some that weren't recognized at all by those who lived with them, but God knew their holiness, the unknown saints. But then there are the saints that the Church singles out for special recognition because of the blessings that they bring to their time and their world. So they're unique images of Christ whom they imitated in a heroic way, and so they're honored and remembered and imitated. So that beautiful phrase from the preface of one of the Masses, from their place in heaven, they guide us still. So they pray for us here on earth, and they sustain us. And before canonizing them, the Church very carefully examines their lives for their virtue, and then looks for miracles to validate their exceptional holiness. Now, I think we could safely say that Theodore is already a household saint. Our own community testifies to that. Practically everyone you talk to who have known him say, yes, he was a holy man. People who knew him and worked with him, they say, yes, he was a holy man, a saint. But going further, is he a saint that the Church should recognize? Does he bring some special blessing to the world of our day? Should the Universal Church officially present him as someone to imitate and to look to for wisdom and guidance and prayers today and tomorrow? Now, I think there are reasons that we can speak about that we could ask the Church to canonize him. For one thing, Theodore is a sign of the holiness of the local church into which he was born and raised, and that's the Diocese of Springfield. He was formed by holy parents, by the Sisters of Notre Dame, who taught him in grammar school, by the priests who served in Sacred Heart Parish, by his neighbors and by his friends. Bishop McDonough, the Bishop of Springfield, said recently, when he welcomed the prospect of the canonization of Theodore, he gave that very reason. He said it validated what he knows to be true about the people he serves as bishop. Said, they're holy people, he said. I am a bishop of a holy people. But often their holiness goes unrecognized. And he said, when you have a saint that comes from them, then their holiness is verified. There's a holiness that is verified in that local church. And I think also for us, Theodore's canonization would also verify the holiness that's present in our province and in the community at large. These are very important things today because people doubt the holiness of the church. They doubt the holiness of the local church. They doubt the holiness of their own communities. Now, of course, does that mean that we just canonize Theodore to feel good about ourselves? Canonized saints are bigger than local heroes. They have a role in the greater church. They're guides to the holiness that the church and the world needs. Now, recently, the writer David McCullough wrote a book called 1776 about the beginnings of the Revolutionary War. And in an interview, McCullough said that he wrote this book right after the World Trade disaster on September the 11th, 2001. He wanted the American people to see a time that was just as tragic as the one that they were going through, and to see the heroes that were there so that they could learn from their example. Now, again, does the church or can the church at large learn something from the virtuous life of Theodore Foley? And I think that yes, it can. That his virtue is not only heroic, but it's also timely. It's something that we need today. Just let's think about today, the world in which we live. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a book recently called A Secular Age, which won the Templeton Prize for Religious Writing last year. He describes our age as an age of authenticity. He says it's an age of expressive individualism. So he says, and I quote him now, "It appears that something has happened in the last half century, perhaps even less, which has profoundly altered the conditions of belief in our societies. The 60s," he says, "are the hinge moment of that time. Everyone senses that something has changed. Often this is experienced as loss, as breakup. A majority of Americans believe that communities are eroding, that families and neighborhoods, even the government, they sense that people are less willing to participate and do their bit. They're less trusting of others. And the causes cited for these changes are many: affluence and the continued extension of consumer lifestyles, social and geographic mobility, outsourcing and downsizing by corporations, new family patterns, burnout, which result in burnout and overwork, suburban spread, the rise of television, others, and so forth. So he says we're living right now in an age of expressive individualism. Now, the individualism he describes, he says, didn't just begin now. It goes back as far as the 18th century when our holy founder, St. Paul of the Cross, began his life. It developed through the Enlightenment. But what's different now, he says, is that individualism is not just belongs to some elite groups. Individualism is in everybody, he says. That there's a sense that it's pervasive in our Western world. And maybe the best way you can summarize it is a little thing you hear very often, that we're living in the me generation. The me generation. See, that puts individuals before the common good. It values human rights, choice, freedom. These are all good values, by the way. But it's also the now generation. It's critical of corporate entities like governments, the church, religious communities, because they don't change as quickly as people would like. And then in the area of belief, the me generation is searching for some higher reality. It's not crassly materialistic, but it's uncomfortable belonging to a church. It wants to be spiritual, but not religious. So again, we can see according to Taylor, this is the time, it's a very complex time in which we live. Now, Chesterton has a little thing, he says, a saint is an antidote to the poison of his time. He's an antidote to the poison of his time. I think we could see it in someone like Mother Teresa. In a world that neglects the poor, we have Mother Teresa, who focuses on the poor. She's an antidote to that forgetfulness of poverty that we might see in our generation. Now, again, I don't think you can see Theodore in the me generation. Now, he was a very humble guy. That's what Father Nicholas said in that description. He's a very humble guy, a very self-effacing community person, committed to the common good. He was committed to the common good. And he also, I don't think you could put him in the now generation either. He wasn't an impatient man at all. He was a man of utmost patience, of great, great patience and acceptance. Now, I think that through his life he exemplified those virtues, but he exercised them most heroically, I believe, as a general consultor and a superior general from 1956 to 1974. Now, just think of what he went through. I just tried to do that with that video, is to indicate the broader conditions of his time. He saw membership in our community climb to its highest in 1968. We had 4,152 religious. 6 years later, he saw the membership drop to 3,238 religious. In other words, almost a quarter of the professed Passionists had left the congregation. Here's what he wrote to somebody in 1972. In 1967, we had 720 students. We've only 350 in the entire congregation, and it's still dropping week after week. Now you can actually feel, what a man like that must have experienced, and he's in charge of it all. He's head of that community. How would you react? What would you do? But the heroism that I can see in him is that he never lost hope. And not only did he never lose hope, but he forged ahead. He wasn't paralyzed by the situation or fearful of the future or withdraw from planning. In other words, most of us, I would suppose, when something really tragic happens, we begin to pull in. We begin to get frightened. It's not the time to think about what's going to go tomorrow or the next day or whatever. Our focus becomes extremely small. But you can see that with Theodore, and he wasn't a person who was a visionary person at all, but his vision came from his basic hope and trust in the providence of God. You can see that over and over in the books that in the letters that he wrote. It's interesting that early on he began those great journeys throughout the rest of the world. He saw something there that was extremely important for our future, and that is this: that the community does not depend upon the Western world. The community is a global community. So he began even then to realize that we have to prepare for the future. I have to check this one little story out, but I heard it a couple of weeks ago. Theodore Walsh told me it. In the Philippine Islands, at that time when he was coming through on visitation, They had just started a little seminary. I think Theodore said there were 2 or 3 people in that seminary at that time. The provincial at the time, our provincial, said we should close this place, it's not ready to go. Theodore said, keep it open. Keep it open. And from that really daring move, we have what we have in the Philippine Islands today, a very vibrant, strong, large community of religious. He was a person who trusted in others. And again, I'm going to use the story that Larry Bellew always tells about Theodore. If you don't mind, where's Larry? I don't want to take his story. Larry, can I tell this story? When Larry was retreat director in West Springfield, there was a youth retreat, and he brought some of the students in to help him on that retreat. And some of them were over the top in the way they were promoting the retreat. Someone in the community wrote to Theodore and said, there's heresy here in this place. There's something really bad going on. You should do something about it immediately. And Larry gets, I got to get that letter, Larry. Larry gets this letter back which says, Dear Larry, I'm coming home soon to visit, and I'd like to go to the Red Sox game. Do you think you could get us some tickets? And then maybe we could go out and we could get a little lunch after that time. And then maybe we could, you could bring me down to see my sister and so forth and so forth. Then he gives a few other paragraphs about the little stuff that's going on in Rome. And then he said, oh, by the way, Larry, somebody wrote that there's a heretical trend in that retreat house of yours. And I wrote back to Father and I said, no student of mine would ever be a heretic. But you know, there's great trust in that, isn't there? There is a tremendously interesting trust. He trusted in what he could see in his community. Now, if you look at the way Taylor describes our time, you can see that what we are really losing is this sense of trust in the providence of God, in what is going to happen to all of us, and to the church at large, and to the world at large. I mean, look at the latest stuff going on in the financial markets. You know, there's a fear, there's an absolute fear that's taking over. But you know, if we need virtues today, it's the kind of virtues that we would see in Theodore. He didn't have a raft of new ideas. You know, he was a man who loved the past. He had a good sense of history. He knew where the church had been, and he knew where the church had gone. He loved to look at the world at large. And again, those are virtues that are really not bad virtues to have ourselves, because we can become so inbred. But to go back and say, if we were looking for someone, an example that the church needs today, virtues that the church needs today, virtues that we need today, I would say he's a good model. Holy man, all right. All of the people who are interviewed said that. There are a couple of quotations which I put in my little biography of him that I think express that, you know, so well. But here's one of my favorites. He went to Brazil, because he wouldn't know the language there in Brazil, Portuguese. But one of the missionaries describes his visit there, and he says this. He said, he visited our mission in Belo Horizonte. He was well received by our poor people, because we taught them that he was the successor of St. Paul of the Cross, for whom they had great esteem. In our liturgies and socially, he was so free and simple with everyone. There was nothing artificial or affected about him, no desire for anything special because of his office. The wearying schedule, the poverty, the climate, the food, all these conditions the people experienced, the missionaries experienced, he accepted graciously. He was there as a brother visiting us, one who had come to see his brother missionaries. He saw the love of Christ. We saw the love of Christ in him. See, that's the characteristic that you could see in most of the people that seem to have visited him, or that met him in those times. I find some things I find about him very interesting. I was reading the other day his letters to the Passionist nuns. Of course, this was around the time of the council, and they're wondering what they should do. Should you, when you come as an election of a superior, should you come and kiss their hand? Should the people of the community come and kiss their hand or not? Those were the questions, some of the questions that the Passionist nuns were asking. He never dodged those questions. He answered them as best he could with a graciousness and a care. I noticed in many of those letters, Dominic was writing them out for him, right, Dom? You did a lot of those letters, you know that. He was writing out those letters with a tremendous appreciation and care for those women and their questions. And that was the way he dealt with pretty much everyone that seemed to have come to his desk and come to look for his advice or whatever. Never belittle them, never put them down. One of the great things that is a hallmark of the generation in which we are present, in other words, we're talking about this me generation and the now generation, is its stand on human rights. Its stand on choice and freedom. We say those are good things. That's got us somewhere in this world of ours. But Theodore has that also. A tremendous respect for human beings. In other words, he blends what we would say would be the best that we could get out of our world. It would be that first of all, that loyalty to institutions, that patience with a changing world, but at the same time, that ability to respect and to know what individuals are all about. There's a beautiful quotation, that was a beautiful quotation Peter had there at the beginning, but here's one I would just like to end my presentation with. He's writing to a sister who's worried about the future. So when all is said and done, the essential thing today is to preserve the spirit of prayer and sacrifice and poverty and to love the cross. If we do this, time will take care of the other things. Most of all, we must practice the love of our Lord for one another. This will really bring the blessing of peace, of fruitfulness, and generous discipleship. So I really think that he is someone. Again, certainly I think he's a household saint already. But I think also we should present him to the church as someone whom we think could have the honors of the altar. Good, thank you.